Well, we have been looking at the story of the Judges and all of its gore and all of its bloodshed. And yet in that chaos, in that anarchy, we have seen the most perfect man, the Son of God. Well, the episode we're going to be discussing this morning is a controversial one, to say the least, isn't it? Jephthah's daughter. There are two opinions of this, but I have got an opinion based upon my own studies, and I'm sure many of you will share that same opinion. But what we do know is that Jephthah is the story of love, it's the story of sacrifice, and it is the story of honor. So let's go through it. We're going to see how God provides. So Israel sin, they suffer, they're going to seek and they will find a savior. And the suffering they're going to be brought under at the moment in this chapter is the nation and the tribe known as Ammon. Ammon is the enemy. So let's just remind ourselves of this story. We're going to go through it super fast. In Judges chapter 11, verse 1 to 2, it says that Jephthah is the son of a harlot. So this man shares the same father as his brethren, but a different mother. He's the son of a harlot. And after this, he and his brothers grew up, and his brethren are going to thrust him out because of this. This is a story told many times, isn't it? This is the story of Joseph. They thrust him out of their house. They didn't want, brothers and sisters, those brethren did not want Jephthah to partake of their father's inheritance. Because after all, this man was the son of a harlot. He was blemished. He didn't deserve the inheritance of the father, according to these brethren. So if you notice in verse 3, Jephthah then, he flees from his hometown in Mizpah, and he then saunters to the land of Tob, and he lives in Tob for around about 20 years. Then we come to verse 4. And it came to pass in the process of time that the children of Ammon made war against Israel. And the threat in verse 6 reaches boiling point because his brothers now have no option to come to their brother to ask him to fight for them. There's a certain amount of irony here, isn't there? Or as you say, irony. You know there's an R in irony, right? I don't know. Irony. But there is irony because his brethren now are coming to seek him to save them. And well, that's because in verse 1, you will notice that this man Jephthah is a mighty man of valor. And they need him. So in verse 9 to 10, Jephthah now agrees. But there are certain conditions for him to help fight the cause of Mizpah. There's clauses in the contract as they sign the deal, as the signatures are inscribed and the parchment is passed from hand to hand. And, well, the deal is that, well, he will help fight for his brethren as long as they swear at Mizpah, which means the watchtower, to make him captain of the family, head of the family. Now, the tables have turned. Because now who has ownership of the father's inheritance? It's Jephthah. Oh, he knew what he was doing, didn't he? This man was a rather smart, strategic, clever man. He now has the inheritance. He's in possession of the father's legacy as they make him captain of the family, head of the family. There's one thing we need to know about this man called Jephthah. I think you'll all agree that he was a godly man. Very godly. And we know this because in verse 15, all the way to verse 27, he sends messengers to the king of Ammon. And Jephthah in this letter provides extensive knowledge of Israel's journey. He quotes Numbers, he quotes Deuteronomy to present to the king that they deserve the land they've inherited. In other words, this man Jephthah cherished the heritage of Israel. He loved the God of Israel. He loved the people of Israel. And he loved the land of Israel. And that letter documents his desire of the love of God. We can safely say, without any hesitation, that Jephthah not only is godly, he's methodical, he's cautious, he's thoughtful, he's well informed, and he seeks approval. We know this because in verse 29, the Spirit of Yahweh was upon him. This man is crystal clear in his thinking. He knew full well that God was with him because of his love for the people of God. Now we come to the 30th verse. And Jephthah vowed a vow unto Yahweh and said, If thou shalt without fail deliver the children of Ammon into mine hands, then it shall be that whatsoever. Now notice that, whatsoever. This is not specific. He left this to God. Whatsoever cometh forth of the doors of my house to meet me, when I return in peace from the children of Ammon, shall surely be Yahweh's, and I will offer it up for a burnt offering. Now we know that Jephthah was a man of valor, faith, and principle. And if you compare, we won't do it, but if you just compare verse 30 to verse 32, this vow was yielded before the war on Ammon. This vow happened before the war. In other words, he's careful. He's not rash. He's incredibly precise in the words he proclaimed in that fateful vow of verse 30. Now we're going to just dissect. I think you'll agree with me. We have to dissect this vow. Would you agree with me? Nod your head. We have to dissect it. The first thing that we need to notice, in that phrase where it says whatsoever, now what's fascinating is other translations such as the RSV and Rotherham, which are all literal translations, don't say whatsoever. They say whomsoever. So clearly Jephthah here is pointing out a person. Whatever person walks out this door. Now, interestingly, in verse 31, the Jerusalem Bible, the NAB, the NET, the ASV, the WET, and Rotherham all say, not I will offer it, I will offer him up for a burnt offering. So Jephthah doesn't just want a person. Jephthah is thinking about a man. A man. Now, I don't have to go into this in any detail at all. We know explicitly, factually, in its actuality, that Yahweh condemns human sacrifice through the fire. It is an abomination to the God of Israel. We know this. In fact, to pass your children through the fire is to worship the pagan god called Molech. And ironically, if you were to worship the god Molech, then you were from the tribe of Ammon. And that just happens to be the enemy facing Israel at this very time. So it would not, brothers and sisters, be the passing through of fire. Leviticus, Deuteronomy, Psalms, the Kings, the prophets, all inscribe in the golden thread of God's handiwork that the fires was sacrilege. But it doesn't say through the fire, does it? It doesn't say that. It actually says, I will offer him as a burnt offering. So it's not through the fire, it's as a burnt offering. Now, when we think about the burnt offering, we've got to go through the book of Leviticus. And the burnt offering is put towards us in Leviticus chapter 1. Now, we would know Leviticus chapter 1. Leviticus chapter 1 tells us that a male animal was burnt as a free will offering. A male animal, not just a male animal without blemish was to be offered. Now we know this cannot be a vow for an animal, can it? Because what if an unclean animal walked out that door? What if a little roach or a serpent came out of that door? Would Jephthah, a man of the law, have to offer something unclean? That too would be abominable to Yahweh. It would be sacrilege, wouldn't it? So it couldn't be an animal. It had to be a man without blemish of the human species. So we've got to go to another law where there is an offering of a burnt offering. And that offering is in, Numbers chapter 15. And have a guess what, brothers and sisters? Numbers 15 is when one would perform a vow. What's Jephthah doing in this very moment? He's performing a vow. Do you know what Numbers chapter 15 and verse 8 tells us? Numbers 15 and verse 8 says that one would prepare a burnt offering when performing a vow. So the offering that he's making is of a vow. In other words, Jephthah on this fateful day is vowing to offer somebody who came through that door, and then he would offer a burnt offering. The vow was for the person, and the offering was the sign of approval. It was the declaration of that person. It was to cement the deal. The signature of the inscription, the signature of the contract was the burnt offering, because the vow had been made. So what was this vow, brothers and sisters? Well, we've got to go to the law of the vows. And the law of the vows is in Leviticus chapter 27. Leviticus 27, you will notice in the first 3 verses that one could vow another to the service of the tabernacle. Now that makes sense, doesn't it? Jephthah is vowing here, according to the law of the vows and according to all of this, a male without blemish in service to the tabernacle, and then once that has been approved, a burnt offering would be made. Now you will notice in Leviticus chapter 27, and you look at the first 3 or 4 verses, you will notice that if one would vow another to the tabernacle, there was something known as the redemption price. Whether you were male or whether you were female, and whether you were of a certain age, there was different prices of redemption. So you could vow someone to the tabernacle, and if you needed them a little bit later on, you needed help in the field, you could purchase them back at a cost. It was known as the price of redemption. But unfortunately for Jephthah, he's performed a very special vow. It's known as the reciprocal vow. It's mentioned actually in 1 Samuel 1 and Genesis chapter 28. And the reciprocal vow is a vow in which one would vow someone to the tabernacle for God's help with the cause. In other words, I will vow you this male without blemish to the tabernacle, and you help me fight the cause of Mizpah to overcome Ammon the enemy. It was a binding contract. You give me something and I will give you something in return. It was known as the reciprocal vow, and Numbers 30 tells us this was binding. It had to be fulfilled. It was sacred. It had to be honored. Deuteronomy 23 tells us that the vow had to be paid without hesitation. Hence why in verse 35 of Judges chapter 11, Jephthah says, I cannot go back. And Jephthah had authority now to do this. Why might you think he had authority? He's now the captain. He's now the head of the home. He now has the inheritance, and now the tables have turned in the favor of Jephthah. And whoever walks through that door is going to be offered as a dedication of lifelong service to Yahweh in the tabernacle, with a burnt offering to be made afterwards. So where else in the Bible do we have this principle? Because I think actually God is laying down a fundamental principle. Where else in the scriptures do we find the idea of a sacrifice in service? Well, they're all true. I'm just waiting for the right one. It's in the New Testament. Rhymes with Lomans. Romans chapter 12 and verse 1, it says there, present your bodies as a living sacrifice, which is your reasonable service. A sacrifice was usually death, wasn't it? But this was a sacrifice of the living. What use are we, brothers and sisters, in the service of the truth if we're dead? We are living sacrifices. We are vowed to the service of the ecclesia. And that idea there in Romans 12, the word present, means literally to stand before. This person who was vowed had to stand before as a living sacrifice, which was their service, their reasonable service. So here's the question. Who might you think Jephthah expected to walk out of the doors of his house in Mizpah? A male, without blemish, who was to be offered for service. Who was most likely to walk out of that door? One of his brethren. The brothers who sold him out. And what better lesson to teach a brother than to put him to dedication in the service of Yahweh, to devote him. And I like the idea it's without blemish. And what did they accuse Jephthah of being? A man of blemish, born of a harlot. And how this vow is going to turn against the man we call Jephthah. In verse 33, we know how the story is to play out. Jephthah subdued Ammon, and there was victory in Israel. And now Jephthah, in verse 34, came to Mizpah unto his house. And he's there now, celebrating with his men. He'd won it. He'd won it. He'd got victory upon Israel. He'd taught his brethren a lesson. And he now has the inheritance, the favor and the providence of God. And how often in our lives do we find that moment, the highs of our life, and we pray, thank you, God, for answering my prayer. And then God turns it against us. He puts us right back into that fire, because it then says, and behold, his daughter, brothers and sisters, came out to meet him with timbrels and with dances, for she was his yachid, his only child. And beside her he had neither son nor daughter. Why is Jephthah so surprised at the daughter? Well, yes, he expected his brethren, but where should his daughter have been? She shouldn't have been in Mizpah. The daughter of Jephthah was not born in Mizpah. She was the daughter of the man in Tob. Miles and miles away, she was in Tob, but she's found her way to the house of Mizpah. And you will notice that she's got timbrels. So where else in the Bible do we find a woman celebrating victory with timbrels? This is Miriam. Miriam from the deliverance of Egypt. And she walks out celebrating with who? The family of Israel. Deliverance out of bondage. You know, this daughter, brothers and sisters, I have absolutely no doubt, when Jephthah lived in that land of Tob, and they sat together as daughter and father, what do fathers tell their daughters? Stories. And what is a father's favourite story? Their life. And I believe he would have told his little daughter, that little child, that little Yahid, that little only one, of the time he was exiled from his home. He would have told her the stories of his grandmother, the harlot, and the circumstances that entailed in that little episode together. He would have told his daughter of the love of God. He would have told stories of those who faced similar circumstances to him, who were shunned out, that God was with them. The story of Joseph, I presume, would have been a famous story, and how he rose to the ranks of the heights of Pharaoh. And his daughter would have listened at the feet of this father as they told stories together. And then one day there was a knock at the door. And the Jephthah opened his door, and there was a messenger from his brethren. "We need you, Jephthah. We need you to help fight. The Ammonites are against us." And his daughter would have heard this. And he would have said to his daughter, "Stay here." But she couldn't, brothers and sisters. She loved him. And she followed him back to Mizpah, waiting for the victory, because she knew that the Spirit of Yahweh was upon him. And when he was there with his brethren, celebrating as a family, she runs out that door, celebrating with her father. That those stories have now come into fruition. The legacy of Joseph played out a second time, the captain of the inheritance of Mizpah. And she sees her father's eyes. And they're no longer eyes of delight and joy. And she sees a very familiar face etched in, a face of pain. It goes horribly wrong, doesn't it, in verse 34, because she was his only one. We've seen that phrase before, an only one. It's that word Yahid. Psalm 22, verse 20, translates that phrase, only one, to the word my darling. This is my little darling. His daughter was his only one. In fact, if you look at the word only one, it comes from the very root that means to be joined together. This tragic life that he had, this little daughter was his only delight. She was his absolute everything. He loved her. He adored her. And all the inheritance, who was it for? Was it for Jephthah? It was for her. To become captain of Mizpah, to claim the inheritance of the father. It was all for his daughter, his little darling. And now the vow is now going to turn against Jephthah. You know, that word Yahid, verse 34, my only one, is so unique. It's used in a previous episode. And you'll never have a guess where that episode is, where that phrase only one is used. Have a guess. What would you like it to be? Genesis chapter 22. And God said, take now thine only son Isaac, whom thou lovest. Now Abraham, of course, had other sons, but the special son Isaac was their marvelous relationship together. And what did God implore Abraham to do? To offer him as a burnt sacrifice. A burnt sacrifice. And Hebrews chapter 11 tells us in verse 17 to 19 that Abraham in his heart with full intentions went to sacrifice his son. When God said sacrifice him, according to Abraham, he'd already done it. And we know that because the faith of Abraham tells us that believing in the resurrection, Abraham received Isaac back from where? The dead. According to Abraham, when God said sacrifice your son, Abraham said, he's already dead to me. But the angel stopped him because, brothers and sisters, God only wanted one human sacrifice. And that happened to be the only one of him. But Abraham was willing to do it. And if Abraham was willing to offer his only son in sacrifice, the least thing Jephthah could do now was to vow his daughter's life to the service. Romans 12, both only ones became living sacrifices in two very different ways. And that indelible principle is to play out in the greater type. God the Father who would fully pay, wouldn't he? Zechariah 12 uses that phrase in verse 10, that the only one, the Yahid, is used of Jesus and the Father. And there's one marvelous verse in the Gospel of Mark, in the 10th chapter, in the 45th verse. Do you know what Mark 10 verse 45 says? It says that the Father gave his only one's life in sacrifice and vowed him in the service. And there we have Isaac and Jephthah's daughter sandwiched together in the life of Jesus, a sacrifice of service. And now Jephthah at Mizpah stands in the position of a father with his darling. And he looks at her. And in verse 35, when he saw her, he rent his clothes and said, "Alas, my daughter, thou hast brought me very low, and thou art one of them that trouble me. For I have opened my mouth unto Yahweh, and I cannot go back." The reciprocal vow. He's a broken man, and the cost, of course, is going to be his little darling. And, well, I'll ask the question again. Why might you think he wanted to be head of that home? It's all to do with that inheritance. He'd fought for it fair and square. He'd longed for it as the elder of the house, and now he'd got it. Now, brothers and sisters, this is really important. How important was the inheritance? How important do you think it was? Well, Joshua 1 verse 6 tells us that the inheritance wasn't just God's blessing, but it was also the family legacy. And it wasn't just the family legacy, it was all about the promises. This was all about the promises. To lose an inheritance, brothers and sisters, was worse than death. You were cut off, as it says, from the land of the living. And now, not only has Jephthah lost the inheritance, but now from this vow, his daughter has lost the promises. There was hope for Isaac, wasn't there? There doesn't seem any hope for Jephthah's daughter. She's cut off. And yet Psalm 15 verse 4 tells us that one who walks blameless is one who keeps an oath even when it hurts. And Jephthah's got to keep that vow. Now here's a question. Who is just as faithful as Jephthah in the story of his chapter? His daughter. She sees him mourning and she doesn't question once, does she? Jephthah says, "My daughter." And her response is in verse 36, "My father." In Genesis 22 and verse 7, Abraham laid the wood on his son and Isaac, and, well, there was no struggle there, was there? Absolute obedience, just like the daughter of Jephthah. And what did Isaac say as he was laying upon that wood? "My father." Abba. And in the Gospel of Luke in chapter 23 and verse 46, as Jesus was upon the tree, placarded there on a pole, he cried with a loud voice, "Abba, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." It was utter obedience between all three of them as they surrendered their life to their father's vow. And his daughter, as Jesus says, "I commit my spirit," his daughter says, "Father, do according to which hath proceeded out of thy mouth." She was submissive to her father's vow, and she was submissive because Israel's salvation depended upon it. She was to become the victim of the vow of her father. And in verse 37 to 39, we know there that for 2 months she asks to go up to the mountains to bewail her virginity. Now, if she was to be killed, brothers and sisters, she'd be bewailing a death. But she's not. She's bewailing her inheritance, her legacy, her posterity. And why do you think she's bewailing her legacy, brothers and sisters? Because she loved her father. It wasn't her legacy. It was her father's legacy. She wanted him to be a grandfather. She wanted children. But she's bewailing. She's bewailing her legacy. Clearly, brothers and sisters, alluding to the fact that this little girl, I say little girl, she'd be a young girl. She's bewailing the fact that she desperately wanted children. Would you agree? You're bewailing your virginity. You want children. And now she's forbidden in an oath, in a vow. And you'll notice in verse 39, what was the sacrifice? The sacrifice was to know no man. Devoted in service to know no man. And the day came after 2 months, where in that little home of Mizpah, that house of trauma, Jephthah took his daughter, held her by the hand, and walked her where? The tabernacle. Now, where was the tabernacle, by the way? In Shiloh. And she walks with her father, hand by hand, and he crouches down and gives her a tender kiss. And there he waves her goodbye. You know, in Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 32, we know, don't we, that Jephthah is written in that catalogue of faith. So where is the faith, brothers and sisters? Have we seen that faith? Where is the faith in Judges chapter 11 that implores him to be in that golden tapestry in Hebrews chapter 11? Why is he a man of faith? Well, you'll notice in all of the people mentioned, those titans of faith, they all sacrificed something. And Jephthah, he'd sacrificed it all. His daughter, his posterity, his inheritance. And we're told of Abraham that he believed in the resurrection, that he knew that he would receive Isaac back. What of Jephthah, brothers and sisters? Do you think Jephthah shared that same spirit of faith? Do you think? Because Jephthah's vow was absolutely unique. He couldn't go back on that reciprocal vow. Now, you'll remember, won't you, the law of the vows when one would vow a man or a woman to the service of the tabernacle. You remember the redemption prices? Well, they're always fluctuating dependent on the age and actually the gender of the person being vowed. And the priest would look at them, they'd ask their age, and they would make a price, the price of redemption. Let's just think about a few facts. Would you agree that his daughter, Jephthah's daughter, was unmarried? Absolutely. Would you agree she was the age of childbearing? So what age might you think she was around if Jephthah lived in the land of Tob for about 20 or so years or less? Well, I would say she would be around about 14 to 16 years of age. So what was the price if Jephthah wanted to purchase her back at 14 or 16? How much would he have to pay? He'd have to pay 10 pieces of silver. Now, what we do know is in Judges chapter 12 and verse 7, Jephthah was a judge of Israel for 6 years. So Jephthah died after this event in 6 years' time. Now, he couldn't redeem his daughter, of course, because of that special vow. So how old would Jephthah's daughter have been in 6 years' time? Well, she would be over the age of 20. Would you agree with that? And you'll never have a guess how much the redemption price of a woman over the age of 20 would be. What would you like it to be? $30 pieces of silver. And if Jephthah couldn't redeem her, who facilitated that redemption? Who was sold for 30 pieces of silver? This is the cost of the Messiah. Jesus made sure he will receive her back. Well, Jephthah's going to find out. that it was the anointed one, the high priest. And how ironic is it that when Jephthah vowed her, when he vowed her to the tabernacle, he felt that he'd lost everything. Would you agree with me on that? He felt he'd lost absolutely everything. But you know what? The moment he made that vow, the second he made that vow, he won her the kingdom. He won her the prize, brothers and sisters, the prize amongst any other prize. Hebrews 11, going back to Abraham, believing in the resurrection, Abraham received Isaac from the dead. And I believe Jephthah shared that similar faith. He's going to receive her back. Not only will he receive his daughter back in that price of redemption, but Matthew 25, verse 34 tells us that they together in the kingdom will inherit an everlasting inheritance together. He won her more than he could ever dream of. The moment he made that vow, his prayers were answered. And brothers and sisters, little does Jephthah know that his prayers are to be answered beyond the grave. Notice the phrase in verse 40, that the daughters of Israel went yearly to lament the daughter of Jephthah the Gileadite 4 days in a year. Now that phrase lament there, you might have a different translation. I'd be interested to know, what other translations do you have for that phrase lament? To speak with, to rehearse. It became an annual memorial to go and visit the daughter of Jephthah. And all the daughters of Israel would go from all across the land to Shiloh to lament with her all the days of her life. Now, that's how the story ends in Judges chapter 11. Of a father and a daughter bidding farewell as she's dedicated to the service of the tabernacle. And the curtain closes then on the life of Jephthah. But I'll ask you a question. Do you really think the story ends there? Absolutely not. I think the story continues in the chapter of 1 Samuel, chapter 1. Does anybody remember what the last event of Jephthah was? He destroys Ammon, but there's one more victory yet to come. It's in chapter 12. He has victory over the tribe of Ephraim. And actually what we find in the 12th chapter of Judges is that Jephthah is famous in Ephraim. He's the war hero. His name is proclaimed in Ephraim. And at the very similar time of Jephthah's fame, there was a little girl growing up in that very same land. A little girl who was going to have her own traumas. Her name was Hannah. And you'll notice in verse 3 and verse 7 of 1 Samuel 1 that she goes to the house of Yahweh in Shiloh year by year. Now, who else went to Shiloh year by year? We've just read of it. The daughters of Israel went to lament, went to talk with Jephthah's daughter and rehearse her story in that annual festival, that annual celebration, year by year. Could it be, brothers and sisters, that this girl Hannah grew up going to Shiloh year by year to lament? Because it makes sense, because the time frame between these two events is approximately 30 to 35 years. And what we find in verse 7, Hannah is weeping. She's not just weeping. It tells us really that she's bewailing. Who was the last person where we saw they were bewailing? It was Jephthah's daughter in Judges 11 and verse 37. And Jephthah's daughter was bewailing her virginity, but here Hannah is bewailing her infertility. And it seems to me both of these women could not have children in very different circumstances. So what might you think she's going to do about it? Well, you'll notice in verse 11, she's going to produce a vow. And she vowed a vow and said, O Lord of hosts. Who was the last person to offer a vow? Need I ask that question? Do you think that's coincidence, brothers and sisters? This was a vow that was given from Jephthah. She vowed a vow, if thou wilt indeed look on the affliction of thine handmaid, given to thine handmaid a man-child. A vow of a man. Who else made a vow of a man? Oh, it was Jephthah, but it all went wrong. This one's right. Give me a man-child, then I will give him unto Yahweh all the days of his life. She vows at the tabernacle to offer her child to God. Who do you think inspired that, brothers and sisters? Who else do you think inspired her to vow a child to the tabernacle of God at Shiloh? This is the story of Jephthah told twice in two different ways, isn't it? You know Jephthah's name, do you know what it means? His name means he will open. And if you look at that word Jephthah and you follow that word through the scriptures, do you know what it's used for? It's a name used to open the womb of the barren. He will open. Hannah's womb is going to be Jephthah. It's going to be opened up. And as Jephthah vowed his daughter, she's going to vow a son as a free will offering to God. Oh, this is the inspiration. This is the legacy. You know, Jephthah thought his legacy was lost, didn't he? His legacy is living in with Hannah. He will open. And in 1 Samuel 1 verse 24, like the story we've just played out, she brings the child to Shiloh, to a man called Eli. And notice this, then she offers a burnt offering. Just like Jephthah, the law of the vow in Numbers 15 and verse 8, you don't offer the child as an offering. The offering becomes symbolic of the child. And she vowed him to the tabernacle. And there was Eli. Anyone know how old Eli was when he died? We're good. 98. Who might have been the high priest at the time of Jephthah? Could well possibly, the maths work out, it's the same high priest. This priest was famous for vow keeping. And now Eli is presented with this young boy, and I imagine his mind flooded back to the moment where a daughter was offered to his service. Now, if Eli is there, who might well have been there? In fact, I'm almost certain of it. The daughter of a man called Jephthah. And this time, it's not father and daughter walking to the tabernacle together. This time, it's a mother and her son, another only one, walking to the tabernacle where Jephthah's daughter is serving. And she knows, brothers and sisters, she cannot have children. She bewailed her celibacy. And right at that moment, in walks a 3-year-old Samuel. And the high priest, as we know, is a man called Eli. Who were his sons? Hophni and Phinehas. Have you ever thought, brothers and sisters, that that vow, unbeknown to Jephthah, protected his daughter all the days of her life? What was the story of the judges? Every man did that which was... Do you think she would have obtained a good husband in her life? Every man did that which was right in Israel. Israel was filled with wickedness. A generation that knew not God, says Judges chapter 2. Have you ever thought, brothers and sisters, that that vow protected her even more than that? Because what were Hophni and Phinehas up to in the tabernacle? Laying with the daughters at its gate. But this daughter had sworn a vow of celibacy. She was protected from the horrors outside the tabernacle. So where was Hannah's confidence? Would you vow your son to that, knowing what the two sons, the priests, were up to? Oh, I believe she knew that there was a woman who was protected from those horrors. And I believe that's why she had confidence in her vow. And that's why I believe that Samuel grew in favor, it says in 1 Samuel 2, verse 26. Who might you think would have been the godly mother to Samuel? I believe it was the daughter of Jephthah. And I believe she mothered that infant Samuel. And I was so pleased that our brother this morning, earlier on, who teaches a child Torah? Proverbs 1 verse 8. A mother. And that little boy was taught Torah by a daughter of extreme, immeasurable faith. Little did Jephthah know that she repaid that vow by raising one of the greatest men in the history of Israel. A titan, brothers and sisters, a fire blazer was Samuel. Psalm 68 verse 6 says that God sets the only one in families. The Yahid he puts in families. And here was Hannah's only one, her little darling. Now it's become Jephthah's daughter's only one. And if Jephthah's daughter became the mother to this little babe, who might you think became his father? Samuel. Samuel. Here am I, the father. Is that not the story of Mary? A mother who just so happens to be a virgin, handing an only son to the Father for him to do the Father's business. What a beautiful way, brothers and sisters. And over those years, in that tabernacle, the years went on, and I know there comes a point where you know that it is impossible to have children. And that time had now passed. It was gone. There was no hope. And in walks, one morning, a little boy whose name means in the Hebrew, God hears. You know, we think, don't we, that it was Hannah's prayer that God heard. But I think at the very same time he was hearing another daughter's prayer. I think that son was named not just because of Hannah's faith, but because of the daughters of Jephthah's faith. God provided a son for a barren woman, a mother for an orphaned boy, and a child for a woman who vowed celibacy, all in one moment. Jephthah gave his daughter to God only for God to provide her with Hannah's son. And we talk about the invisible and visible hand of God. You believe in providence, brothers and sisters? If I was to ask the question, what's your story? How did you come into the faith? What is the history of your family? I think we are the most providential group you'll ever meet. You notice that? We have some marvelous stories of God's work. And there's Genesis 22. Isaac was the only one of Abraham because, well, according to Abraham, that little boy was essential, absolutely essential for Abraham's future purpose. And he was right. Isaac was essential for Abraham's future purpose. And I believe Jephthah felt that his daughter was his only one because in his mind she was important for his future purpose and his legacy. But he was too absolutely right, because he's to find out that God provided a greater path. Who did Samuel become? Who did he pave the way for? Well, he was the one who anointed the very first Messiah. Saul was a failure, so it went into the land of Judah, of the family of Bethlehem, and through biblical providence, that little boy, Samuel, the seer, in his old grey hair and his flowing locks, was to anoint that man, to pave the way for the greatest only one of them all, who just so happens to be the son of David, Jesus, the Anointed.
Don't forget to hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. Drop a comment in the comment section and let us know what you thought. And make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new upload. Please share it and spread the word. Thanks for watching, and remember to come back soon.